All right, so welcome to Unit 10. We're going to cover standards 14 and 15. We're going to look at imperialism and how that's going to lead to World War I. And we're looking at the U.S.'s involvement in World War I. Not really what caused a lot of the other countries to do what they did, but really focusing on the United States. So, if we go, here are the standards we're going to cover, okay? And we'll talk about those as we get to each of them. But we're going to start with Standard 14. And Standard 14 talks about explain the America's relationship with the world at the turn of the 20th century. All right, so Standard 14A, you should be able to describe how the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines, it's the same time, the same kind of thing. And territorial expansion is going to lead to the debate over American imperialism. So you should know the term imperialism, but we're going to kind of talk about that. Remember, just find that anything that's in pink or purple are your vocabulary terms, and what's in yellow is the stuff that you need to be writing down in your notes, okay? So the term imperialism is where we need to start, and basically that term means how you extend your country's power or influence over other countries through diplomacy or military force. So you learn this in world history. You talked about the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, the Indian Revolt, how the British and the French and the German and the Italians and the Spanish and the Portuguese went all over the globe and took over other nations, sometimes by force, sometimes just by talking and convincing them to allow them to take over, okay? But after the age of industrialization, U.S. businesses are starting to look for other markets, and they're also looking for other places for raw materials. This should sound really familiar from when we talked about early colonial period and the triangular trade route and what Britain was looking for and how we wound up settling in North America. Okay. But the U.S. is also looking not just for raw materials, but more people to sell to and locations for future development. Okay. Now, those people who are in favor of being imperialistic or expanding your country's influence to other nations are considered expansionists. Okay, again, those are people in the U.S. that are looking to spread democracy and to obtain overseas markets. This is where we acquire Alaska from Russia, okay, in the 1860s. And then, you know, us looking at the Caribbean and specifically Cuba. Okay, and I want you to keep in mind this picture behind in the PowerPoint. Remember, I always put something that represents the nation, the unit. We'll kind of look at that a little bit later. All right, so let's start with the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, first of all, it's going to start in the Pacific and the Philippines. Okay, so that's the war in the Philippines. But we had a naval fleet that expanded onto two oceans that operated on both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we sent part of our naval fleet into the Philippines prior to us declaring war because it was just good military strategy. But we noticed that there were things happening in Cuba, and Cuba wanted its independence from Spain. This is where Spanish-American War comes in. The Spanish controlled Cuba, and Spain kept suppressing the rebellion in Cuba. The problem was that we had Americans that lived in Cuba, so the U.S. was fearful for the lives of Americans, so we sent ships down to Cuba. More specifically, we sent the battleship, the USS Maine, to the harbor in Cuba, or Havana's harbor, okay? Now, you have to understand that the Spanish ambassador felt that the U.S. president at the time, President McKinley, was incredibly weak. And he wrote this scathing letter about how weak and thin and small President McKinley was. And this is called the DeLone letter. This is one of your vocabulary terms. You need to know it. So you need to go on ahead and take time and do your vocabulary sheet with this, okay? And I'll give you time in class, but if you're at home, you know, you can do that there. After this letter came out, and I'm afraid my notes might be a little out of order, but after this letter came out, the news sources got a hold of it. And then the USS Maine was destroyed in Havana's harbor. It exploded. And So journalists in the United States wrote these sensational stories, exaggerating everything that had happened, and wrote it so that it would convince the American people to support the Cubans in the rebellion against Spain and the fight for their independence. When journalists write sensational stories and exaggerate the facts or exaggerate what's happened, it's called yellow journalism. Again, they're your vocabulary words. Write them down, okay? And we'll look at reading an article that's yellow journalism. We can find a lot from the last election year, this 2020 year. There's a lot of yellow journalism happening, okay? All right, so when the USS Maine exploded, and that should say USS Maine exploded, Americans were absolutely outraged. How could this happen? How could somebody destroy our battleship? President McKinley went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war because if you remember anything about the unit on creating our Constitution and developing a new identity and a new government, only Congress can declare war. So President McKinley goes to Congress and says, I need a declaration of war. In the meantime, we're trying to get everything set up and get our troops ready. Theodore Roosevelt, a military man, not president yet, organizes a group of troops, cavalry, horseback riders, known as the Rough Riders, to go into Cuba and fight. And they're very good at what they do, and they're very successful. The Spanish fleet, the Spanish are going to turn and run. They're going to go to their ships, and they're going to leave Cuba. But as soon as they do, they sail out into the U.S. Navy, okay? And so the Spanish-American War really only lasts a few months. And the bottom line is that the Philippines and Cuba want their independence. The problem that the United States has is that the Philippines don't really have a very strong government. We're not convinced that they can take care of themselves and keep themselves safe from invasion. And we're concerned about Cuba as well. And Cuba's in the Western Hemisphere. And remember the Monroe Doctrine way back when President James Monroe, in that political cartoon where Uncle Sam draws the line in the sand, and the Monroe Doctrine says no European powers can come into the Western Hemisphere and take control of any of these countries because the U.S. will fight them. Okay, so I want you to remember that. All right. So, the Americans, the United States decides that the Philippines aren't going to be allowed to be an independent nation. We're not going to give them their independence. We're going to take control of them. We're going to take care of them. All right. This prompts a war in the Philippines. So there's your Philippine-American War. The Philippines will eventually gain their independence. This is at a time, too, when we annex Hawaii. We take U.S. plantation owners, overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. I want you to try and say that. There's some really neat statues and placards on the islands of Hawaii dedicated to her. But we annexed Hawaii because we recognize the importance of having a strategic location for our Navy and our ships and our military bases in the Pacific. And that is kind of like a pit stop or a stopping point where we can resupply and refuel. And this is a time when the United States acquires a lot of new territories, and it sparks a debate between anti-imperialists and imperialists in the United States. We gain Hawaii. We have Alaska, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Okay? And you see these names down here. William Jennings Bryan, Mark Twain, and Andrew Carnegie are going to be your anti-imperialists. They don't want to be bothered. They don't want to get involved in foreign affairs. Okay? All right. Now you're keeping track of the yellow, right? These are your notes. Okay? Anti-imperialists, here's the arguments for their side of the argument. Here's their points for their side of the argument. You know what? We fought against Britain and they were imperialists. We don't need to be like them. Being imperialistic is not democratic. It doesn't honor what the natives want for their country. And the ownership of colonies is going to bring us into wars with other nations that we don't want to be a part of and we may not be prepared for. Okay? And we don't really need to deal with. But imperialists, those that are expansionists, who really want to expand our influence across the globe, say, you know what? Colonies were needed to provide natural resources and markets. We need new colonies. We need new places to get these raw materials. We have a moral obligation to help the colonial or native people. And this is where that idea of white man's burden is going to come in, that it's our responsibility and our obligation to help those people. That Americans should grab the remaining territories before the Europeans do. Let's beat them to the punch. And then these colonies are going to provide strategic naval bases, locations, encourage trade, and bring us wealth and power. They both have substantial arguments for their side of this conflict. But this is something that's going to long divide our government and our people.